Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Monica Krup, and I am co-editor-in-chief of the Race and the Law Review.
Hi, good morning, everyone. My name is Michael Chachura, and I'm the other co-editor-in-chief. We want to thank you all for joining us here today on the third day of our symposium. This past year has been a challenging year of racial reckoning, full of conversations about race.
So we wanted to use our symposium as a platform to address how law schools can better participate in these conversations. Specifically, over the course of the last 3 days, we've discussed how to build an anti-racist law school and curriculum.
The Race and Law Review analyzes the intersection of race and the law, and we couldn't have chosen a more poignant topic to address. We hope to foster meaningful conversations here today, just like we have in the past few days.
Before we begin, we want to thank our faculty advisors, Dean Cuison-Villazor, Professor Hawkins, and Professor Paradise, and Habiba Johnson for helping us put this symposium on. Lastly, if you have any questions, please use the Q&A channel instead of the chat function, and the speakers will not be calling on participants with their hands raised. So we look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you so much to our distinguished panelists and our moderator, Dean Cuison-Villazor. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. I'm excited to be part of this conversation. And before I introduce our panelists, I just want to give an acknowledgement of all the work that Mike Chachura and Monica Krup have done in order to organize this 3-day symposium, virtual symposium that has had a lot of that led to important conversations about race and the law, the role of administrators, of deans and professors in creating an anti-racist curriculum and legal education. So thank you very much to the Rutgers Race and the Law Review and Mike and Monica for your work. As mentioned, I'm Rose Cuison-Villazor. I am Vice Dean and Professor of Law at Rutgers Law School in Newark, and I am honored to moderate this panel with colleagues whose insight will be valuable as we examine what does an anti-racist legal education look like. I will briefly introduce them. I'm not going to give their bios. And then I'll frame the conversation by presenting the 2 key questions that we hope we'll be able to examine in the next hour. We have Dean Alexi Freeman, who is Associate Dean for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Denver Law School. She will be first to speak, followed by President Kellye Testy, who is the President of the Law School Admissions Council and former Dean of the University of Washington School of Law. Next to speak will be Dean Kristen Mercado, who is Assistant Dean of Admissions at University of California, Davis School of Law. And then finally, but not last but not least, is Dean J. Austin, who is a Senior Associate Dean of Admissions at Rutgers Law School. Thank you very much for being here. This whole week, we have had critical, important, and difficult conversations about what it means to have an anti-racist legal education, an anti-racist law school. Your role as admissions officers, admissions directors, as a diversity and inclusion and equity dean, and also the president, the leading organization of the Law School Admissions Council are instrumental in helping to implement the resolutions and statements that have been passed by several faculty across the nation in establishing and committing to an anti-racist legal education. So here are 2 questions that I hope will begin our conversation. First, with respect to those with admissions practices that all of you have had some role in, what might be policies, practices, and programs that with respect to admitting law schools that can help to implement what an anti-racist law school might look like? And so with that, I'll begin first with Dean Freeman to help shape the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I will just quickly echo the huge props to the students who I don't know managed to plan such robust events while also being law students. So I really commend you all for bringing us all together and for hosting this series. So I was asked just to briefly provide like an overall frame, and then I'll talk a little bit later in the retention space. To me, and I think probably to all of us, it's become very, very clear that law schools must step up and respond to the demand for greater attention to race, racial justice, racial injustice, anti-racism, et cetera. When thinking about what to do, at Denver Law, we took a step back and we tried to articulate what is our theory of change, right? Like, what are we trying to address, and how are we gonna make that happen? What's our plan? For us, we embrace a social justice theory of change, right? One that is grounded in power building. And why I think this is relevant, right, is we see power as the ability to shape and influence others, right, and decision-making processes. To me, oftentimes long-term goals for structural change, which is really what we need, right, when we think about anti-racism in legal education, that often can't be achieved right away initially. And that's often because there's a lower level of power and influence. So I think it's really important to develop sort of what I would call like stepping stone efforts along the way that are needed to help you remain on that power building arc. We believe, I know very clearly, I know my colleagues here do too, that there are some reforms that are going to require dramatic upheaval and investment, and we have to work to achieve those reforms. But I also think we have to introduce this framework in a meaningful way immediately, knowing that immediate action can repair harms that have occurred and continue to occur to our current and prospective students, particularly those from minoritized communities. And then also acting now matters day to day for our current students, right? The folks we are trying to serve. And I also think it will let us build our power, right? So to let us lay the groundwork for reaching those longer term reforms that we wish to see. So when I speak a couple minutes, well, maybe not a couple minutes, 15 minutes, et cetera, later today, I'm going to try to focus on some of those things that are immediate, right? While knowing that we're still all working on long-term structural work as well.
Thank you very much. I mean, those are powerful comments to begin the conversation with about repairing and power and imbalance. And so why don't we then take us through the law school applications process, because that's really where it begins. We have students, undergrad, graduate students who are interested in going to law school, particularly in this day and age where we have a national reckoning with race and race in the law. Dean Testy, can you talk to us about what are some of the work that you're currently doing with LSAC and trying to, and as you think about anti-racist legal education?
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being here. I want to echo the thanks to the students and all the faculty, staff, administrators. It's wonderful that we have this opportunity to talk about building anti-racist approaches to legal education. I just want to say it's wonderful to be here. I'm Kellye Testy, as you noted, now president of LSAC, but a longtime law professor and dean working for social justice and working for equity inclusion in law. I use the she, her, and hers pronouns, and I also want to just say that I really have enjoyed the Monday and Wednesday programs too. I thought they were excellent, and I'm just so excited about the learning that's coming together from this effort. I also want to note that the reason that I came to LSAC a few years ago was that I feel that when you're talking about admission, what you're talking about is the entry point to that entire learning journey and to the profession. And we must have our hands outreached and do that right, because if we don't do it right there, we can't diversify the profession and build an anti-racist legal system like I hope that we can. So we are very much, from our founding all through the 75 years of our history, focused on trying to work with schools and candidates to do that. Some of you may not know that the reason we were founded as LSAC was that before that, admissions were done narrowly, looking not at potential, but more at what had you already done. And that tended to reinforce privilege because it tended to emphasize what school did you go to, who do you know, lawyers in the family. And so legal education deans and others came together to open it up and say, let's build a way to make sure we're looking at potential, not just privilege. And that mission is one that still stays as core for us. And I want to thank all my admission colleagues who are here and work in this realm with us, because they're doing the hard work. And I know you got an opportunity to hear from two in just a little while about how to actually, bring that to life. I thought what I might do, Rose, today, just in opening comments, is give a little bit of some facts about the current admission cycle, and also a quick run through on things that I think are helping, are working, and then a few things that we could talk about that might help us do even better. And I want to begin by saying that we're excited about this admission cycle because the national reckoning with racial justice and social justice is really, I think, inspiring more people to come to law school. So we see that right now we're 20% up over last year, and there's been kind of a gradual trend up, but this is a good jump. And that is across all racial groups. And so, as one example, Black and African American candidates are up 23%, so more than the general number. And likewise, we've been working hard to help open access to learning so that people can build the skills of reading, writing, and analysis that the LSAT tests and that you need to succeed in law school. And we're seeing great reflection of that skill acquisition because the number of applicants with higher LSAT scores is also up across all groups. And again, as an example for Black and African American candidates, the number of candidates with a high LSAT of 160 or higher is up 48.4%, which is wonderful to see. And at every score band from 160 through 180, which is the score scale, the percentage increases for Black and African American candidates is higher this year than for the population generally. And so I want to just share that I'm encouraged by that pool, because building pipeline is so critical. If it's we have to work on retention, as you all know, and the licensure and on into the profession, but it starts with that pipeline and that pool. And as we do admission, then one of the things that LSAC has been so clear about for so long is that the LSAT should be only one factor in a holistic admission process. And that's really important, that we focus on doing admission holistically. So we're not reducing any candidate to a number or any one thing, but we're looking at all things. And that's really important because access to learning is unequal in our world. And that means that no matter what measure you use of academic achievement, if you use only one measure, you're going to hurt candidates that are minoritized because of that unequal access to learning. And so we really feel strongly that that holistic process is so critical. And that is something that we advocate for all the time. I hope we can talk a little bit later about some barriers to why that doesn't always happen. But it certainly is clear that the research shows that using the LSAT as one factor in a holistic process best promotes equity. I want to talk very quickly about a few things that we do to try and promote equity beyond that standard. And one is, of course, pipeline building. I'm sure most of you have heard of our decades-long plus programs that help, nearly for 2 decades has supported thousands of students from underrepresented and historically marginalized communities on their law school journey. And that's so critical. I'm a first-generation college grad myself in my family, and I didn't know that journey. I needed someone to, help me see what that was. We also have worked on increasing the fairness of access to learning by offering 2 different ways to do free preparation for the LSAT and thereby acquire those skills that will help you in law school. And the LSAT remains the best predictor of law school success because it is designed for law and it's focused, as I noted, on 3 fundamental skills. And so through the Khan Academy, there's a wonderful LSAT prep used now by over 70,000 users per month. And also through our own platform, Law Hub, there's the same opportunity. And we're seeing wonderful efficacy and results through both of those efforts. We also have to, though, focus on more than just that skill preparation. We have to focus on finance and access and equity. And so we have a fee waiver program that gives out around $5 million per year to waive fees to apply to law school. We also provide LSAT vouchers for quiet spaces to test, and also provide loaner laptops so that we're helping address any inequality around access to internet strength and laptops, et cetera. And that, I think, has made a tremendous difference. Now, I know that we'll have more time later to talk about potential solutions, but I do want to just mention that we will really, I think, having to keep focus on that holistic admission process. And I know that Jay Austin and Kristen can share what that really means when you're doing it. And I'm going to defer to them, the experts on that. We also need to build more pipeline, more and better, especially given the impacts of COVID. And I think too, we need to start to talk about supporting justice impacted individuals pursuing legal education much more fully. And my colleague Liz Bodemer has done a wonderful study and survey about how much that matters. We saw vividly again this week the inequity in our criminal justice system and with policing. And that is an issue that legal education needs to really address if we're going to make the difference that we hope to make. So let me stop there, Rose, and I will be happy to talk about retention and some of the other issues as we go forward. Thanks again for having me with you.
Great, thank you. And thank you to you and LSAC for all the work that you're doing to helping to break down barriers to legal education. You mentioned pipeline, and so that's a great segue for Dean Kristen Mercado to talk about some of the work that she does, including the King Hall pipeline for undergraduates that help them to prepare them for law school. So Dean Mercado, would you like to go next?
Thank you so much. And thank you so much for having me and for putting on this opportunity to talk about some really important issues. So yes, I'm going to talk a bit about the pipeline and share some experiences that we've had at UC Davis that may be instructive and informative for those of you who are either already working on programs or thinking about starting them. If there are not people in the pipeline, then the work that we're prepared, all the support and all the curriculum that we develop, right, we're not serving the students unless we get them there. And what we've learned through organizations like LSAC and others who have done the work to kind of look back and see when do students first start thinking about law school is that it's early. It's earlier than we think, right? College is almost too late. But let's talk about what we've been doing, and I'll share a bit about what our experiences has been. So there's a few different players in the law school pipeline space. Obviously, schools, particularly universities and law schools, are big players in this space. There's also nonprofit organizations like LSAC, another big one in this space, Access Lex, that also operate programs that also provide a lot of institutional support. Schools are not able to have teams of amazing statisticians who can provide us with global trends and things that help us inform what we should be thinking about and when we should be thinking about interventions. Professional organizations and associations, state bars have become big actors, and I'm going to share just a little bit about what's happened for us here in California with the State Bar of California. And then there's also private sector organizations, law firms, test prep companies. There are a lot of really great programs operated by law firms, and honestly, the biggest asset that they bring to the table is often the money, which is in short supply for a lot of the other players in the group. And so, and that's a piece that can't be ignored, right? Access to a legal education does have a pretty significant financial component. And so providing resources not only to get you to the place where you gain admission, but also making sure that you have resources to actually attend law school is a big piece of that. So I'm just going to talk a bit about our own law school pipeline program, which has already been mentioned, the King Hall Outreach Program, or KHOP for short. For those of you who don't know, UC Davis School of Law is also known. Our building is named King Hall in honor of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. And so our nickname, I guess you might say, is King Hall, and thus the name for our program. It's 20 years old. We just celebrated our 20-year anniversary. And so the reason that KHOP started by my amazing mentor and predecessor, former Assistant Dean for Admissions, Sharon Pinkney, was in response to Proposition 209 in California, which eliminated the use of race and affirmative action in admissions for California public schools. And so being a bright, experienced person with a great knowledge of pipeline and, of course, law school admissions, okay, we are going to face some significant obstacles. And so let's think about how we can make sure that we maintain a diverse student body. And so she, with the support of the law school, of course, started KHOP. And because in California, as a public school, we couldn't use race or ethnicity as one of the criteria, we looked at what are the kind of other common attributes. And so K-HOP is modeled on a program that officially targets students who are the first in their family to go to college and or come from a low income background. Unfortunately, and this continues now 20 years later, those tend to be pretty good proxies for students of color. And so most of our students who come through the program, overwhelming majority of them are members of one or more racial and ethnic non-white groups. And so we also tend to have a lot of first generation students and a lot of low income students. Many of our students kind of satisfy both of those criteria. And what we do in K-HOP is really try to focus on where we can offer the best expertise. It's had different incarnations. It's been a residential program. It's had a really heavy academic component where it focused at the college level, kind of building the skills to be successful in college in order to make them attractive law school candidates, and as well as have them be prepared for the academic challenge and academic rigor of law school. We've included stipends at various points. We were at one point the recipient of a very generous grant from LSAC, which allowed us to do those things. But we've also pivoted in recent years to become more of a model that's pretty common amongst law schools, which is it's a Saturday program, an all-day workshop program. We do 4 to 5. We offer 4 to 5 Saturdays, and we do it twice a year. And so the idea is where we can be of the greatest benefit to these students is by providing them with a really insider's look into what happens in the admissions process. So we really try to provide them with a very honest and very candid look at what is happening at a law school admissions office when they get your application. And so we try to provide them with the ability to know what's ahead of them, to prepare for it, how to best demonstrate their strengths, how to turn weaknesses into places where they are opportunities to grow. And so we focus a lot on each part of the application process and really a lot of individualized counseling. We also do mock law classes, provide opportunities to interact with current law students. Our Dean Kevin Johnson, speaks to them. We do a lot of interaction with alumni of the K-HOP program who are now out in the world being lawyers, and they share their experiences both as students, as law students, and then as practitioners, and kind of talk to them a little bit from the mindset of knowing exactly where they are right now. We also provide some support in the form of financial assistance for LSAT preparation courses. Thanks to LSAC, we also can point to a free option in Khan Academy. So that's been great to also offer that resource, and has been a bonus for us. And we've been really successful. So over the years, nearly all of our K-HOP graduates finish college. Almost 50% of them have gone to law school. Many have gone to Davis, which is great, but we've also sent students to schools across the country. And that's really important. It's about building the pipeline to the legal community at large, not just to Davis. And so I think that's what's been really successful. And it's a lot of that individualized counseling and a lot of that individualized attention, which provides for success. It is takes time, right? Doing it kind of on that individualized approach means you don't see like huge change overnight, but over 20 years, we've been able to really achieve a lot. And I think have found something that really is sustainable over time. It's something that works with other law school priorities and is successful. And that's really kind of the key to all of that. I know we're trying to watch for time, so I'm not sure if I should pause here, and maybe if I have time, I can talk a little bit about the state bar program, but that's our K-HOP program, and I'm really happy to answer questions at any point too offline. Feel free to reach out. So I'll pass it back to you, Rose.
Thank you so much, Kristen. I do see that some questions have already been raised, and we will be sure to, I'll probably combine some of those questions. 2 of them raised questions about the LSAT. But thank you so much, Kristen. I was glad to have supported K-HOP students when I was still at UC Davis, and I'm really proud of the work that you are doing there. You mentioned the importance of alerting students about what is happening in the admissions office of a law school that they're applying to. And so here I turn to Dean J. Austin. Dean Austin, you've worked as an admissions administrator in a few institutions. And as you know, law school's approach to admissions are largely shaped by faculty and staff. And so how do you, what are some ways in which you have helped empower staff and faculty in addressing some of the social inequities and racial inequities we've seen and barriers to legal education?
Thank you, Rose, and Monica and Michael. Thank you so much for putting this really important conference on all week. It's been amazing, and just a tribute to not only your hard work but also what's happening both at Rutgers Law School and of course Penn State Dickinson as well. And I'm delighted to be here with my distinguished colleagues as well. You know, you're right. I was thinking about, again, I was teeing up the question, Rose, what policies and practices, you know, help contribute to an anti-racist law school in so many ways. And when I thought about this topic, I really thought about what it means to empower from within. And that meant really the admissions staff and of course the admissions committee. So, you know, it's been interesting. Let me parse those out for a second. So at least with the admissions staff, and that's a, you know, kind of a well-rounded area because it can include so many individuals at the law school. But nonetheless, over the last few years, we've seen growth in size, responsibilities, increased programmatic offerings, you know, JD, LLM, non-JD programs, obviously changes in the market. You know, admissions offices have to be responsive when applications are up, and they also have to be differently responsive when applications are down. The offices have developed outreach programs, pipeline efforts, and even some DEI full-time staff have originated in the admissions office and been spun out from that. And then finally, balancing communications, technology, social media. Again, the admissions staff has been often responsible and has to oversee that. I'm not talking just about the professional staff, but also the support staff that many of our offices have. So these different staff sizes and responsibility has to come with training, of course. You know, training means the nuts and bolts of the operations, learning and being able to impart important information about the schools and the programs. But I'd also argue that there needs to be equal attention given to the staff, particularly about the larger forces at work in the world and in the orbit of the school and the region. And that often doesn't happen. And inevitably, when I think about members of the staff and how I think as a manager, it's critical for us to be able to offer the level of expansion in thought and in experiences for the staff. And some of the ways that you can help do that, have them have a greater understanding and be more responsive to the various constituents. And we're talking about one being anti-racist, we're talking about diversifying legal education, we talk about diversifying our law schools. And if you have staff members who have any level of difficulty having conversations with the widest possible range of constituents, that's a problem. And so what can you do there? It becomes a matter of training. And training could be, I know in past, we've had a book club in the office. We've shared readings. We've shared opportunities to attend conferences and then bounce back those thoughts. And some of the conferences can be internal conferences and as well as external. You know, LSAC just sponsored a very large and robust equality conference on LGBTQ plus AI plus. You know, I invited all of my staff to attend because whether you're the receptionist or the director of financial aid, I think these are areas that you need to be able to be comfortable with and have conversation about. So those are really critical. And I think particularly during COVID, while we've been isolated but close, you know, only talking about the business of the operations is too narrow. Things are happening in vacuums, and I realize many of our staff are also have family members who are essential workers who've been directly impacted by COVID, who have been impacted directly by some of the racial injustices that we continue to see. And so giving grace and space for staff to be able to have those conversations is really critical. With admissions committees, it gets a bit more problematic in terms of, in some ways, and I say because, you know, one, there are various logistical components of admissions committees in-house. One, they could be strictly a policy committee. They have no involvement at all in reading applications. So that could be one. There could be admissions committee who has both, right? They have policy responsibility and they also review files. And then there's some, you know, at some law schools I've been at, I didn't have an admissions committee per se. So the type of structure that you have may depend on the type of conversations that you have with the various individuals in the admissions or the admissions committee, because the committee could also very well be a committee that's the same year after year after year. They could be a committee of faculty members who are reappointed each year. There could be the committee members that include other members of the professional staff at the law school, librarians, clinicians, legal writing instructors, student affairs, DEI people. So I think part of it is understanding the composition of your committee and then being able to speak to that committee. One way of speaking to the committee is using your own internal narrative. And let me pause here because I'm going to just share a narrative. 23 years ago this month, I was in the transplant unit at the University of Pennsylvania Hospital. I was in one room. My older brother was in another room. We were waiting to do a transplant that was going to take my right kidney and put it into him. There are two pieces to a transplant. Any kind of transplant procedure. One, the nephrectomy, which is the removal of your kidney, and then obviously the insertion of the kidney into him. So here I am laying in a hospital room that night, in and out, people are there all evening, constant, because this is 23 years ago, we were doing a laparoscopic procedure. I was the only 5th live donor laparoscopic procedure at Penn. And for laparoscopic, as opposed to how kidney transplants happen most often, you were literally cut wide open. So there'd be no question about the removal, but a laparoscopic just meant you were just going to have very tiny removal and they were going to take the kidney out of one large incision. So because I was only the 5th live donor, they were bringing in a specialist from Johns Hopkins to do this. And so I was told throughout the evening that at some point the physician, the transplant, the surgeon would come in to see me. I'm not really paying much attention, in and out all evening, people are walking in. Really after midnight, into my room walked wearing a white coat, of course, a very young, very pregnant white woman. And she said, "How are you doing?" And I said, "I am lousy. I've been waiting for the surgeon all evening. They promised me someone would come in and talk to me." And she said, "I am the surgeon." And I said, "I'm so sorry." And she said, "No, it happens all the time." And I said, No. I'm so sorry. I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I did that. Now, mind you, 23 years ago, we didn't use the words implicit bias, unconscious bias. Those weren't in our lexicon just yet. But here it was, me who have spent my entire career thinking about these critical questions of access, inclusion, of representation, of modeling. And I did exactly what I would want people not to do. The thing is that she was so gracious because clearly she has spent her entire life to this point and so recognize that. So I say that because you can't own the responsibility of the narrative unless you look internally. And for me, being able to look internally and recognize that we all have biases. We all have biases. The question is, what do we do with that? So going back to the practices. So one, there needs to be more conversation about the impact of implicit and unconscious biases. And even, as I say, the most thoughtful members among our communities, and we all are incredibly thoughtful, we will harbor some biases. The question is then, again, what do we do? For admissions committees, they often end up relying on the traditional measures, that we all see, because I found in my experience that some committees are just risk adverse. They are more comfortable recognizing, well, I know what that school is, I know what that GPA is, I know what that LSAT score is. So that work, that's my comfort level right there. And they can't see beyond that, regardless of what it is. So I think being risk adverse sometimes prevents us from recognizing the enormous breadth of the lived narratives of our applicants, particularly. Also, being risk adverse then translates into really weird statements. And I'll just share some that I've overheard over the years. Well, if our yield is really low on Black applicants in that high range of LSAT score, should we really spend one of our really valuable admissions offers if they're unlikely to accept? this is where, talking about the yield game, right? And people worry about the yield because has some impact into the metrics on the rankings. So that's also very critical. So I realized that not every chief admissions officer is going to be able to clap back at every comment that comes either from staff or the admissions committee, because it can be very exhausting. But I do think that recognizing our bias and acknowledging those and then working to diminish them, which is what the literature tells you to do. You're not going to erase them, you're not going to forget them, but recognizing them and diminishing them it goes a long way to critically understanding what it means to be an anti-racist law school. So I'm going to stop there. Thank you, Rose. Thank you all. Look forward to more conversation.
Thank you very much. Speaking of working internally, addressing biases and practices within our own institution, it's important for us to think about what happens to students when they get into our law school. How do we support them? What are some practices that we need to do in terms of retaining and supporting our students? What should we do? And so Dean Freeman, would you mind talking to us about the work that you do as the Dean of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much. And I've learned so much from my colleagues here. I have the real privilege of working with talented admissions folks at Denver Law. And I do want to mention that I work quite closely with them since being appointed in September. And I actually think that's really critical. Certainly admissions officers have very different expertise than I do. But I think if we really want to think about DEI as being integrated in all that we do, any member of a faculty or staff that has a DEI role, I think has to be part of those conversations. And I'm very grateful that the admissions team has been so receptive at DU to that work. But I want to talk a little bit about retention, right? So now they're here, right? How can we ensure that they succeed academically, but also feel like they're part of the culture, the community, they feel like they belong, since we know so much that students from historically minoritized groups often feel like they do not belong. So I want to share a few of the things that we've done in an immediate timeframe that I think that can be really helpful. So one is we are launching this fall a pre-orientation program called Denver Law Ascent. Running this in partnership with Student Affairs, as well as our Academic Achievement Program. And it's a one-week program before orientation. We have a week-long orientation as well. It's before that, and it's designed to welcome and support incoming students from historically underrepresented groups. So it's open to students of color, LGBTQ+ students, students with disabilities, first-gen college students, et cetera. Of course, it's open to all, but it is targeted, right, toward these groups of students. And the idea is that it's going to enable our students to both build community among their classmates, among each other, but also among faculty, staff, and members of the legal community. And then there's also going to be a big component about developing academic skills and prep, right? So we know that most of these students are not coming from families where there's, generations of lawyers, right? So they don't necessarily know about briefing a case. They don't necessarily know about the Glannon's examples and explanations. They don't know that that exists, right? If you learn that that exists in November before the exam, it's too late, right? So the idea is that we're going to help teach them in partnership with our academic program, how to do this work and what resources are available. We're also going to actually provide them financially, right, with those study skills sets, right? Here are the books you need, right? This is a supplement. This is what all your classmates are doing that you didn't know about, right? That are helping them understand this really complicated torts issue, for example. We're also going to be giving them stipends for food during the week, right? Because we know that we are asking them to come earlier, right? And that means they're stopping their work earlier, they're stopping what else they were doing. So while we can't fully pay them for like what an employment would be for the week, we're offering them something, right? Because we recognize while this is hopefully going to be beneficial for them, it's also taking them away from other things. Now, I should mention that while this is a one-week thing, there's also elements that are built in to support them throughout the year, which I think is critical. We want to better set them up for success, but we don't want to just be like, okay, great, peace out, we got you, right? Like we helped you for this week and now you have to engage. So instead, we're going to be organizing additional community building events, but we're also going to be supplying them with 2Ls and 3Ls to provide specific academic teaching assistant support. So it is a community, right? Now they're also going to be integrated, of course, into all other aspects of the law school, but they're going to have this community both academically and socially throughout their time here, including mentors, right, of the legal community that join us for this week as well. I'm really excited about it. And it was also created in part due to student feedback saying, we didn't know this stuff. How can we better know, right? In a safe space. So this is why we're excited about it. And we're hopeful it's going to be really productive. Another thing we launched this year is what I'm calling paid student diversity assistance. So Much has been written about, I think, the invisible labor, right, that faculty of color, I'm sure staff of color as well, have within higher education, right? Being asked to take on additional professional responsibilities, right, without pay. And many students, I think many faculty like these things, right? We believe in supporting our students, same with staff, et cetera. But it's just this cultural taxation, which is sort of an official term that was coined. Much less has been written about how this affects our students of color and our students who are LGBTQ, et cetera. But it's the same thing, right? When there's a panel, you go into the same 10 students, right? Because you need diverse representation on that panel. Now, to be clear, I think a lot of our students like paying it forward, right? They believe in the cause. They are tied to ideas of justice, equity, and diversity. But that doesn't mean that we're also taking them away from other things, and we're not necessarily validating the value of the experience and expertise that they bring if we're just sort of asking them to do all these things without any other benefit, right? Even though, of course, yes, this is a good learning benefit for them to present, but it has to be more than that. So I hired this year 15 to 20 students. Now I hired a lot, right? Because when someone has a midterm, I don't want them at my event. I need them studying for their midterm, right? But these students have helped us do a few things. One, they are very much engaging with admit students, right? So students want to hear from other students, right? Again, sending one email one time, not a big deal. Their students are hosting Zooms. They're doing different things to try to connect with students before they hopefully join Denver Law. They're also helping us with pipeline events. So we were able to host this year 25 virtual pipeline events for partners within K through 12 and local colleges. The students, sure, a 10th grader maybe wants to talk to me, but they really want to talk to the student who's actually navigating law school, right? So our folks have been able to do this. Again, they pick and choose when they can come, but it's been really helpful because I think not only does it give them a little bit of money in their pocket at the student employee wage, which matters for these students, but it also shows that we recognize their value, their presence, their knowledge. It forms a community with me and them, which we know also matters, right? Because they know they have an advocate and a mentor. Another thing that we did this year, one of the biggest things I think around anti-racism is who is teaching our students, right? Who are the people that students see and hear from? We need a year-long conference to discuss challenges in long-term hiring, right, for full-time faculty. So, and to be clear, I'm working on that with partners at the law school, knowing that we have to do a lot much more to diversify our faculty. But I also, going to my earlier point, like our students right now, they can't wait, right? They need more faces in the building. So we launched what we're calling the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Practitioner Teaching Fellows Program. Perhaps not the pithiest that it can be. Nevertheless, what it is it allows us to recruit 2 practitioners in the field now who both work on issues as it relates to marginalization and also bring personal experience in this space. So for example, this semester, we have a transgender individual teaching gender identity in the law, and we have a Black male teaching mass incarceration, systemic racism, policing course. I think I butchered that title, but nevertheless. What we did though with these folks is, I think as many of you all know, that adjunct pay is not the best when it comes to, this is not, this is a challenge, right? So what we have done is these folks are paid the standard adjunct pay, of course, but they are supplemented by DEI funds because they deliver a law school-wide talk, which these people can do this in 10 minutes, right? But people are paid to give hour-long talks, and they engage in some informal advising with our students, which naturally often happens anyway, right, when you become a professor, and certainly when the professor looks like you or has a relevant lived experience. The feedback from these classes, while we haven't yet gotten the qualitative official university eval, we'll get that in another month, the feedback anecdotally has been tremendous. And it is both first, like these people have amazing expertise in this area of law, but they are also human beings who have navigated the law school in the same way they have. So we are doing this every single semester. We have another 2 folks coming in the fall. And again, this is not a substitute for really overhauling how we hire those same committees, those processes, but it is a stopgap measure that I think is really critical in adding value. I want to just mention 2 other quick things before I know we have questions that folks want to address. We talk a lot about the importance of mentors, and of course that is important. There's so much research around this. And at DU, we're very lucky. We have a very robust professional mentoring program, and we also have a robust peer mentoring program. They tend to operate separately. And while the peer mentoring program has a clear affinity component, the professional mentoring program does, but we don't often have enough people, right, to make those matches perfectly. So this year, we invited the peer mentor groups once they were already set. If they're linked by affinity, first gen, student of color, et cetera. to add a junior and a seasoned lawyer who similarly identifies, right, to create a mentoring family. So there is like the generation, right, of how to connect the 1L, the 3L, the person 5 years out, the person 20 years out. We did this though with intentionality. We're very lucky in Colorado. We have a nonprofit that is focused on legal inclusion in the profession. So our mentors that are joining these teams are not folks who are like, sure, I'll mentor, which is great, but mentoring is an art. Mentoring is an art for people of diversity. There are different things to talk about. So these are folks that either identified in the same way, but have also gone in and had trainings and discussion, right, about this and are very committed, right, to DEI issues. And I think that is really important because professional mentors who are not can cause more harm and more marginalization of the student. And that happens far too often in the legal community. So we're really excited about this, and we'll be launching it again earlier now next year, right? So that it starts at the beginning, the mentoring family. And the last thing I want to mention is that we've been really working very hard to provide what I would say are holistic wraparound services to our students. What tends to happen in law schools is that different people are responsible for different things. This person's doing the disability accommodations, right? This person is the academic achievement. That's great in the sense that people have expertise and we want to like have people know what they're doing. But what happens to the student, and especially the student who may already feel marginalized, who may have less familiarity, who may have, maybe introverted, may have different cultural norms, all these things, they're like, who am I supposed to talk to, right? Or I don't feel comfortable with this person, et cetera. So what we have done is, and it's spent a lot of time, but a lot of individual outreach, right? So we contact every single student, right, who fills these markers, LGBTQ, students of color, et cetera, incessantly. Sometimes they respond, sometimes they don't, but we're checking in, we're advising on registration. We're saying, great, do you have the study book? If not, this is what you need. The library has this. Here's the process, right? Now, I do agree that students need to be able to learn skills to navigate systems and do things on their own, but you have to provide an entry point, right? And you have to provide a supportive entry point. So we're doing this a lot, and it has made an incredible difference because now sometimes we then get out of it, right? We then don't need to be there, but we've made that link. And I think what we need to think about is that students any law student is juggling so much, right? But in order for students to be successful academically and for their well-being, they need to have supports, right? And they can't navigate all of this on their own. And we're really hopeful that by offering ourselves as folks who want to help them in any way possible and help them navigate this very complex system, they are going to be more successful. And I should also say that our outreach is, students who are below a 3.0, they get an outreach at this time, right? There's different markers, right, in which we are reaching out, but at least they have that consistent face and that consistent person. And I think consistency matters for connection. So I'll stop there.
Thank you. Thank you. There was a lot there, and hopefully we can get to some of those topics about retention, but we do have several questions right now. And so several questions about the LSAT, the LSAT. And at least one question about what about eliminating the LSAT, as many undergraduates, many colleges and universities did this year. They too saw actually a rise in admissions. In many colleges, that was not the case for the colleges. So perhaps if Kellye can start us off with that, and then followed by Kristen, and hopefully we'll have enough time to ask Jay and Alexi to also pipe in as well.
Well, thank you, Rose. And Dean Freeman, I want to say too, thank you so much for the comments on retention, because we have to see that entire educational journey from pre-law to practice holistically. Because if we don't, both admit people and keep them all the way along, we're not going to make the impact we need to. So this really is all part of the same system. And it's impressive to hear these ideas for greater retention. My colleague, again, Liz Bodemer at LSAC, has done a great article on belonging in law schools and how important that is to academic success. And so I think that focus is critical. But I know that a lot of people are asking about the LSAT, and as you might guess, that's a common focus. So let me just make a few points about this that I hope you'll all find helpful. I first want to make sure you know that one of the things that I'm deeply committed to is constantly innovating. So while I'm going to share some reasons why I think that using the LSAT as one factor in a holistic process still remains our best methodology now if we care about equity, we are looking always for greater innovation to promote race equity and other forms of equity in admission. And so we're doing that work, and we want to do that work with all of you. But let me share just a couple of thoughts on your questions. The first one is that it's tempting always to think that if, well, we know we want to do something about educational equity, can we just like kill the LSAT and that'll do it? Well, just as stomping on a thermometer won't cure a disease underlying, it's a similar issue where you won't actually have the impact you want on educational equity by taking that action. And the reason for that is we know that our world is terribly unequal. And there's no question that wealth and other forms of privilege impact every part of the educational process. But if you pull out the one thing that we know to be a consistent measure of potential and help students who may not come from elite backgrounds get recognized, we know that equity won't be promoted. And so one of the things that I think is really critical to understand is that what's called test optional admission policies are not shown by research to promote equity. What they are shown to do is to increase the number of applications to especially elite institutions, so that then their yield rates go down and it looks like they're admitting fewer people based on the admission. But the research continues to support that using a test designed for law as one factor. But we all need to really talk about, why do we overuse the LSAT? We overuse it because of US News rankings, for one. And that's something that I think we all as a legal academy need to talk about together. We need to talk about how to go, to be true to a holistic process. But also please remember that the wealth and other forms of disparity that we're concerned about don't just impact a test score. They impact GPAs, they impact how many activities you can do, they impact who your references are, they impact everything there. And so the more you can make sure that that process, as Jay and Kristen talked about, is one with a great deal of integrity, the more you can help assure equity. And that's something that I would love to hear the admission deans and others reflect on a little bit. But Rose, I hope that's a start towards some of those questions that people rightly are asking and that we look forward to continuing to engage in.
Yes, I think this year has really forced us to think much more deeply. Not that we haven't been thinking about it before, but because of all the inequities that the global pandemic has wrought on everybody. And we were seeing undergraduate admissions dealing with it differently than we have. It forced all of us to rethink and reimagine. And so it's helpful to see and hear about what LSAC is doing.
Yeah, and I would say too that in part two, remember that the undergraduate and the law realms are very different. In the undergraduate space, the SAT and the ACT don't necessarily predict undergraduate success, whereas the LSAT does. And so they may think about that differently. And then also note that we were able to pivot very quickly to allow during COVID the remote administration so that those enrollment journeys could continue. And that's not something that unfortunately we were able to see in some of the undergraduate realms. So good point.
Thank you. Kristen, do you have some thoughts about some of the questions here about the LSAT and also GRE, and how might doing that impact the work that you do?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I'll kind of preface this by saying is that something that I work really hard in working with, we have a different admissions committee made up of faculty and third year students every year. So every year I do an orientation where we get the committee ready. And so one of the things that I really like to emphasize with the committee each year is to remember that the LSAT is a tool. It is a predictive tool, but it tests. What it's doing is it's a very specialized thing that it's actually telling you. It's telling you, okay, this is a prediction based on someone's performance one day in their life, right, of how we think they will do in their first year of law school. It doesn't predict whether they will pass the bar. It doesn't predict whether they will be a good lawyer. It doesn't predict a lot of things that go into being successful in law school and in the legal profession. And so I think, I actually think that we could do okay without the LSAT. I mean, but I do think it really requires you to think think particularly about how else do you demonstrate potential for success, right? And so things like, what are the experiences a student has that allows them to develop skills that the LSAT tests, right? Things like analytical thinking, their ability to problem solve. The LSAT doesn't test a lot of skills that are also important, things like leadership, good judgment, insight, the ability to communicate with other people, right? How do you communicate? Those are all so important and really what makes you a good advocate. The ability to listen, right? We don't do those things. And so I think there actually is some movement in that. We saw the trend has backed a little bit, but we were seeing a lot of 3+3 programs. So colleges were partnering with their law schools to allow students to be admitted directly into the law school, after their 3 years of college and without taking the LSAT. And so there was kind of a bit of that, and seeing students be successful with that. One of the things, there's a research project that Access Lex is doing called JD Next, which essentially what they're doing a couple different things, but Davis participated in it this past year. And the idea is that you have students do, Clio kind of does some of this too, right? The summer before law school, you have them do this kind of essentially like a mini contracts class. And you could use performance on an end of summer, end of program test on that content to be able to use it in the way that we use LSAT, in the sense that it could help us predict with the other characteristics that an applicant has, their ability to be successful in your law school. So, the JD Next is kind of looking at two different things. They're looking at the success of helping students do better in law school when they participate in summer programs like this. But I think their longer term goal is also to say, might there be another way that we measure aptitude in law school, in combination with things like undergraduate GPA, life experiences, all of those things that I think, I've already mentioned and are really important. And so I think I would like to think that we do our best to really kind of think of the LSAT as one piece of a very large puzzle, a complicated puzzle. And I really emphasize with my committee and with my faculty that we need to look beyond just what the LSAT is predicting, and also look at what are the outcomes we see in our students. What are the things that students do that make them successful with passing the bar, with employment? And LSAT alone doesn't predict that. And so really kind of trying to use some counterfactuals to really challenge maybe some of the stereotypical notions we have about that. The LSAT, I don't know whether we'll ever get rid of it. So I kind of try to really work with it in the space that I'm in, and encourage people to not over rely on it. That's obviously easier than said than done when we also are thinking about things like rankings and other optics pieces that go into the puzzle. But I really do think that there's a way to work with it. It just requires a lot of effort, and I think a lot of conversation, and really investing in that holistic review and kind of the work that Jay was talking about in terms of really equipping people to learn how to recognize those things and to think broadly and think diversely, and really focus on all of the ways in which people can demonstrate an aptitude for success in law school and the legal profession.
Thank you. And it's the key terms here that both you and Kellye have said here is holistic, right? Holistic admissions process. But then that also leads us to a holistic support service for students that Alexi mentioned. I'd like to give Jay a chance to also talk about the holistic process. You earlier mentioned admissions. What about retention? And just in terms of time, we have just a couple of minutes. I know 3 of the panelists and 4 panelists, the next panel, are already here with us. So I want to make sure that we give them the transition time. But Jay and then Alexi, if you can quickly talk about some of the holistic services from a support and retention perspective, that would be really helpful.
Yeah, I think some of the retention actually begins even before people end up as applicants, right? And we think about some of the high school programs that are existing in terms of pre-law programs. We think about 3+3+3, and that's, I think Kristen mentioned that earlier. There's the community college to undergrad to law schools, because I think building the support around the students should begin before they're at our law school doors. And there's an incredible wealth of programming around the country at various levels, Clio plus programs. I mean, they've been referenced here, but I see those as real opportunities. And I'm also heartened by many law schools are beginning first generation student organizations and affinity groups. And that's another way to support students, and not just first generations in terms of family experiences, but also in terms of the professional and graduate school, having those experiences. So I think the more that you can build the community around the students earlier and sustain that through the entire, as Kellye says, that pathway from prospect to practice, because even the most recent Marshall Motley Scholarship Fund that the Legal Defense Fund has offered includes a very heavy component of mentorship, because I'm equally as concerned that you think about the leakage that occurs in the associate level for people of color, particularly brown women, and getting them through law school and then having them become completely miserable in the practice is also a problem. So there's so many different, as you say, kind of entry points to be able to intervene at this level. If I could I just want to say something about financial aid, because I think one of the comments in the quote, the chat was about, the impact of merit scholarships and how that does a disservice many. Yes, I think many folks have long recognized that the whole system is upside down. And I actually am trying to get individuals to move away from the word merit in terms of part of the scholarship allocation, because I do think that there has to be a better way to recognize both the mission of your institution, whatever that is, and be able to award students with some financial support based on their fitness and their ability to tie into the mission of your particular institution. But as long as we say merit scholarships, for many people, that is a language, just a buzzword for LSAT and GPA. And I think it's really important to think more expansive about what it means to award students with our limited scholarship support.
Thank you. Dean Freeman?
Yeah, I'll be super brief because I really do respect that there's other folks that everyone wants to hear from. And if I recall, it's maybe is a student panel in particular. So even more, we need to be quiet and give them some space. I will just simply say that everyone and their mother and their brother and their aunt and everyone else is talking about DEI right now, right? This is great, right? We've those of us who identify as people of color, those of us who do this work, like it's a little bit like, where you been, right? These things aren't new, right? With that said, I think we need to seize on this moment, and all of these law firms and corporations that are writing quite robust and thoughtful statements, their statements only go so far. So when we talk about finances, when we talk about support, whether it's supporting them with mentorship, whether it's supporting them with externships, whether it's supporting them with creating a scholarship, whether it's to get in the door or once students are there, whether it's a paid position, I think we should push the members of our legal community that are part of these groups that are now saying, yes, diversity now, right? To do more, to partner more intentionally with us. And I think we have to be willing to make those asks. Because I just think like if folks are gonna say all of these great things, which is wonderful, let's have them be really thoughtful in a variety of ways and a variety of resources in supporting our students.
Thank you very much, President Testy, Dean Austin, Dean Mercado, and Dean Freeman for joining us in this conversation. There's never enough time. There's always not enough time. And Dean Freeman said earlier about the importance of how we could have talked about also hiring of professors, and we would have spent, in 1 hour would not have been enough there too. There were just some topics that the students wanted to cover, but we didn't have enough days and time to do them. But I hope to all who are attending here and listened in that this would constitute as just the beginning of a broader and ongoing conversations about what we can do, what our role is, all of us, in creating an anti-racist law school. I do now would like to turn this over to the student panel on activism and bring it back to Mike and Monica. Thank you very much.